Hello, my name's Katie Munday. I'm currently doing a Master's in Research, or an MRes, at the University of Portsmouth, and I wanted to share a little bit of information about that today. I am doing it on the intersection of being both autistic and transgender, which could include being non-binary, agender, bigender, all sorts of different gender divergences. I'm going to apologise now because I have got workmen in the house today, so you might hear sawing and stuff whilst I'm doing this presentation today, which couldn't be avoided, I'm afraid. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share some of my information with you now. I've got a visual, which I'm also happy to share, and that will be on my website on autisticltd.co.uk. if you wanted to have a look at the visual afterwards as well. And I will be putting a alt text for that as well. And let me just find that. There we go. So basically the research questions that I was interested in were how do trans and or non-binary autistic people express our own intersecting identities? To what extent can narrative methodology enable gender variant autistic voices to be heard? So basically, narrative methodology is just a fancy way of saying storytelling, so how can our stories be better heard? And also, what recommendations would autistic gender divergent people give to improve research which explores this intersection? Now, the rationale here is so these lines of inquiry are going to help explore how autistic gender divergent people can be engaged within work on our life and our lived experiences. And it's going to contribute to the growing field of narrative-based research, which is led by gender and neurodivergent researchers, which includes Adams and Liang, Dale and Sparrow, to name but a few, who do work collecting trans and gender divergent autistic people's stories. These particular questions are of particular importance to me because I'm queer, I'm trans, mass, non-binary, autistic, and neurodivergent for many other reasons as well. And I'm a practitioner who works with gender divergent autistic young people. It was part of the reason that I wanted to do this work, is a lot of the young people that I work with in a youth work setting are autistic and also very very gender creative, very explorative of who they are and how they want to express themselves. But reading into the literature, I'll get to that in a minute, but it just doesn't explore the ways I would like our identities to be explored. The outcomes of my research hopefully shall be of interest to trans and or non-binary autistic people and our families, gender identity healthcare professionals, anyone with a kind of general interest in neurodivergence and gender divergence, and hopefully it can be used to further academic work. It's certainly something I'm going to be pursuing through PhD as well. I'm hoping to get this work published on a free access site so people can read it freely, as I think all academic work should be accessible to everyone. I'm also hoping to do a plain language summary of the work as well, because it's going to be about 20,000 words, so which is not everyone's cup of tea. So the kind of context behind this as well, not just from a personal point of view, but from a kind of wider point of view, is that autistic transgender identities and narratives is a relatively new area of academic interest, and I think it's perhaps due to the increased number of openly gender divergent people in Europe and the USA, and as well as an increase in clinical diagnoses of autism, what people would very, very wrongly call, the autism epidemic, in inverted commas. And I think due to the infancy of this field, much of the research is actually based on prevalence rates, like how many autistic people are trans, or how many trans people are autistic. And they find a considerable proportion of autistic participants who are transgender, non-binary, or otherwise gender divergent. A lot of work has found that. And also that transgender identities have been estimated to be twice as common in autistic individuals than non-autistic individuals, which I found to be quite interesting. That's George and Stokes 2018 who found that. And sometimes this transgender autistic intersection is described as living under the double rainbow. So I decided to call my work Living Under the Double Rainbow, Trans and or Non-Binary Autistic Narratives. And that refers to the colours which represent both queer and neurodivergent identities. But despite this increase interest in the overlap of being gender divergent and autistic, much of the work exploring this intersection uses really stigmatizing language and theoretical underpinnings, which just add to the marginalization of neuro and gender divergent people. And a significant amount of this work uses a pathology paradigm, which frames being autistic as like an impairment or a disorder or a burden. It's actually been really difficult to read around the subject, and anyone who researches autistic identities or trans identities will appreciate what I'm saying here, because it does paint us out to be pretty almost non-human in some ways, which is absolutely awful. And the lack of diversity positive work is, I think, in part due to the academic focus on prevalence rates, and it's utilised to suggest correlations between the issues of being gender divergent and the social deficits, or the so-called social deficits of neurodiversity. And I think the overuse of neurotypical and cisgender perspectives on transgender autistic individuals probably explains the use of pathologizing language and frameworks in past studies, including, the awful extreme male brain theory by Baron Cohen, which I could do a whole different talk on all the reasons why that is extremely problematic. So basically, I wanted to collect and disseminate real life experiences that would allow participants to become self-advocates, and show others that it's okay and often wonderful to be different. And I think sharing these accounts is going to allow us researchers to create more critical understandings of autism and gender identity, and create recommendations for more appropriate and inclusive practice and research, and hopefully the stopping of kind of pathologizing language. So I used a biographic narrative method of investigation. So basically I started, that's Venn graph 2001. Basically we started with one main question, and the participants were allowed to take the answer to that question in whichever way they chose. So there were follow-up questions, so it was more of an organic kind of friendly chit chat than like a really formal interview conversation. I thought that would probably suit participants a little bit better. People also got the chance to have a look at the questions beforehand, because I know a lot of us can be very anxious when we're going into new situations and talking to new people, especially about stuff that could be like extremely personal to us. So I actually got to talk to 12 participants about their experiences as trans and or non-binary autistic people. And I thematically analysed that. So basically, if participant A spoke about, trying to think of something that came up, family estrangement, but also, 2 or 3 other people talked about family estrangement, I kind of grouped that all together. And then that might also be linked to kind of current relationships or kind of stuff like that. So it was just getting all little ideas and putting them together in little groups. And that helped me to understand how narrative methodology, so storytelling, could raise trans autistic voices. And also, it was really helpful for outlining recommendations for future work. So my big 5 themes out of that, so after I grouped all my information, mental health was a big thing that came up a lot, and that included trauma, substance use, toxic relationships. You know, a lot of participants described being burnt out during full-time work and becoming really overwhelmed socially and sensorially, which, yes, I am there with you, unfortunately. Some participants talked on long-term trauma responses to domestic abuse, neglect and toxic relationships. This was not an area which I explored fully, as I was concerned for the mental health of participants, but kind of allowed them to mention it, but didn't use any kind of follow-up questions specifically on those areas, because I wanted to make sure that everyone was safe whilst we were interviewing. Our second theme was relationships, which included difficulty in maintaining friendships and also about chosen families. Several of the participants spoke about queer platonic relationships and chosen families. Many of these participants appeared to create these instead of sexual and romantic partnerships, and in lieu of being connected to their biological families. And some participants spoke of the difficulty to maintain friendships and socialize in group settings, which I don't know is particularly earth-shattering. I feel like that is quite an autistic experience. But I found it very interesting about the queer platonic relationships was brought up by maybe 3 or 4 different people, and definitely about communal living as well, and about how to make a kind of queer disabled communal living, and how that would also help, you know, if anyone in that living experience had children as well, about having multiple people around children in order to help bring them up and raise them and develop them, which I found was really, really interesting. Our third theme was aspirations, which did include gender affirming surgeries, mostly to do with top surgery, actually. Further study, which included higher education, so kind of university study, kind of from a level 3 onwards, which I'm not sure how that translates to USA grades, but kind of GED and above, I would say. So, and also adopting children came up into that aspirations as well. So various participants spoke about their healthcare goals, including gender affirming surgeries and the wish for healthcare professionals to be more understanding. A lot of them spoke about how professionals either understood or partially understood being autistic, or they might understand kind of trans issues, but the likelihood of finding a professional who was fluent in both autistic and trans kind of experiences was just didn't exist, which, you know, shows me that I'm looking at research which is really important, because if there's so many of us, as all this prevalence work keeps saying, then I think it's important that professionals have the ability to you know, to understand more about us, most definitely. And several participants spoke about academic aspirations, including further study and gaining specific qualifications in field they currently work in or would like to work in. A lot of that was around creative work, music, creative writing, and stuff like that, which was really cool. And numerous participants spoke about having or adopting children as a future aspiration. There were talks on how that may be difficult as both an autistic and disabled person, and also as a queer person as well. One of the participants was talking about friends they have in their gay rugby team who had adopted children, and how many more hoops they had to jump through than perhaps you know, a straight or straight passing relationship would have to, which again is not surprising, but is still exceedingly upsetting. The theme 5 was recommendations for future work on trans autistic experiences. And people came up with some amazing ideas, which I loved. The participants Participants were specifically asked about their recommendations for future work on our lived experiences. And many of these recommendations focused around talking to autistic, trans and or non-binary children and adults directly. I think one person said exceedingly loudly and firmly that, you know, we need to stop talking to parents. We need to start talking to the people who are actually affected by this. So children, young people, teenagers, young adults, older adults as well. And participants also gave other recommendations on widening the variability of participants recruited in research, including age, physical disability, and gender identity. And also like the inclusion of non-binary autistic people. Like most of the research that I've read anyways is focused on trans men and trans women, but non-binary people, agender people, bigender people, demi people, all sorts of different gender identities, and therefore people and experiences are being potentially erased, most definitely not thought about, which obviously doesn't add, but which adds to the stigma of those kind of identities and those experiences as well. And there were 2 people who actually said about researching, well, it might be 3 actually, who said about researching the intersection of being trans and autistic, and also living with, I think it was specifically Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue condition, which comes with all sorts of chronic pain and ability to dislocate and various other things. So it was interesting that out of only a small group of people to talk to, that 3 people brought that up. I thought that was quite significant. And I just want to leave this part of our kind of video today on something that one of our participants said, because they wrapped it up really, really lovely. So this participant was from Australia. They're 33 and they're a trans male. And they said, "My hope is that through storytelling, we can humanize trans autistic people more for a wider audience. It's why I think it's so important to improve representation. People really connect with stories, whether films or books or video games. So my hope is that having more trans and autistic characters, we can dislodge some of those old stereotypes and biases people have." And I just thought that sums up everything I found very, very nicely. So I'm actually joined today by my by my husband, who hears me talk about this all the time, Jay Munday. So Jay was going to potentially ask any questions you have about what I've spoken about today.
Obviously, I've kind of got a bit more backside and insider information into all this because obviously of our relationship. But yeah, there's a couple of things that really kind of stuck out to me. Like, were there any genders that you were unable to work with that potentially were potential participants that you didn't get to work with that you would have liked to have done?
Should I stop sharing this so people can see us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would that be nice? Lovely.
There we go.
Yeah, so there were, I thought, funnily enough, my ethics application, I and ahed about how many people I might talk to, and I ended up with thinking I'll talk to 10 people, and I thought even that might be a stretch. I thought this is, this is a lot of time and effort that participants have giving to me, and giving to this work, which is brilliant. But I'm also aware that we're massively burnt out people. Some of us don't like talking to different people about different things, and I just thought it would be difficult to kind of recruit people, and I put my recruitment out and got 75 people back, and in true autistic clarity of style of communication, people said, my name's John Smith and I am agender, trans masc, long list of identities, and also not just gender as well, but like disabilities, neurodivergencies, stuff like that. So they, and one person had put on there about being cat gender, which is not something I was particularly familiar with. Unfortunately, that person had come in right at the boundary, just as I'd got my 10 people that I needed which accidentally turned into 12. So that would have been really, really brilliant. Like the idea of kind of, I'm not saying this person is a furry, but you know, the kind of idea of kind of animal-based genders and perhaps how that works with kind of furry identities and stuff like that, like kind of animal-based identities that sometimes are linked to kink but aren't always. So that could have been a really, really interesting person to talk to, I think. But a lot of the people I spoke to were non-binary, or they would use non-binary much in the same way I do, actually, of just like, this explains it to people easier than like this cosmos of gender that I'm living in currently. So a lot of them were or trans masculine, trans men as well. So so it was nice to talk to so many non-binary people. Yeah.
Amazing. Were there any particular themes or surprises that kind of came out of your research? Particular surprising themes, I mean, that kind of thing.
I think how many people, I spoke about it anyways, but how many people spoke about queer platonic relationships and living communally was really interesting. I don't know, surprising actually, but like was really, really interesting. And yeah, and how many people wanted to adopt or foster children, you know, and obviously that's a big part of if you go in for gender affirming medical transitions or anything like that. Like obviously you have to plan, you know, if you want to have children in a more typical fashion, then you know, things need to be done, eggs need to be frozen, whatever it is. So I shouldn't have been surprised by that, like the forward thinking of people. It also, like in my personal experience, it's just anecdotal, but like forward thinking is quite an autistic thing as well. So yeah, that was really, really interesting.
Okay. And how much, I don't know if you want to go personal with this, but in terms of like the research that you've done, how does that align with your own experiences in a lot of ways?
It's difficult to say because a lot of research is very much based on prevalence rates. So it's a lot of, and it's based on what I was saying, like about the pathologizing language and stuff, which I think was a big reason and a big push for me to do this work, is because I don't align with it. And if I don't, then I know that there are plenty of others who won't either. So, but stuff like Maxfield Sparrow edited a book called Spectrums. Yen Perkis's work. There's a few people out there whose work, Lydia ZX Brown, I don't know if I'm saying their name right. There's a few people out there who are autistic and trans or gender divergent whose work makes sense to me. Even if it's something I don't specifically identify with, like the way they talk about things and the stories they've collected, like are okay. So we have issues, but also we have like a lot of gender joy and we have a lot of autistic joy. And whereas work about either autistic people or trans autistic people is like, you know, suicide rates and rates of homelessness and stuff like that. And it's all very based on you know, this idea of deficits and problems and issues, and which, you know, absolutely needs to be researched, but only if like practice is improved. Like it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, this is really awful for this group of people, we're going to do nothing about it. Oh, okay. So yeah, so I found myself in a few bits of work, but they were autistic trans pieces of work. Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of your own study and reflecting on that, would there be anything that you'd like to change in terms of your process or anything like that?
Change in terms of my own research process.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, are there any improvements on your study that you would like to make?
Yes, I would say a few. Yeah. I think my biggest issue was out of 12 people, I had one person who was dual heritage and the rest were all white. And for the most part, quite highly educated professional types, which is brilliant. And absolutely, I want to talk to these people, but also, you know, it would be nice to talk to more people of color. It would be lovely to talk to, I mean, talking to trans autistic sex workers would just be like mind-blowing, like mind-blowingly interesting. And there's plenty of people out there who are. So I just think, as with all things, it's like the diversity of people. Like, we had physically disabled people there and people with chronic illness. But yeah, I would just like to have it be a bit more diverse, which I'm not really too sure how to do that. I think that's been a big research problem across the board for years, but would definitely like to be. So if there are any autistic trans people of color watching this, please get in contact with me.
Which leads me nicely onto my last bit. So I think actually it's really important that we just kind of let everyone know where they can find you and you know, where they can get hold of you.
Yes, so I run Autistic and Living the Dream. I'm on Facebook under that name. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is social_parasite. And I also have a website, which is www.autisticltd.co.uk, which is where I'm going to put my findings for this research, this poster, plain language summaries, all of that stuff. It will be probably towards the end of the year when I've actually put in my dissertation, but I want to make it, you know, freely accessible to people. People can download it, use it however you want, as long as you reference me or whoever I've referenced. Yeah, so that's where you can find me if you want to connect because you're doing similar work, you just want to make, you know, ideas or whatever, just connect with me. That would be brilliant. Yeah.
Right, that's all my questions.
Excellent. Right. Thank you very much for listening to this video, and hopefully I hear something from some of you guys soon. Bye.